Hello everyone. Today we wanted to present to you two case studies of environmental health crisis. One being the well-known Toms River crisis and the other lesser-known Nyanza Waste Dump cleanup site located in Ashland, Massachusetts. This project was done by Christopher Hawkins, Nicole Larm, and Lauren Quattrochi. First, let's discuss Toms River. Toms River is a town located in New Jersey. This town experienced an increase in cancers from the mid-1980s to the early 1990s, specifically in childhood leukemia, brain cancer, and central nervous system cancers. This could be described as a cancer cluster, which could be defined as a closely grouped series of events or cases of a disease or other health-related phenomena with well-defined distribution patterns in relation to time or place or both. The term is normally used to describe aggression of relatively uncommon events or diseases. This was later linked to hazards associated with waste disposal from Ciba-Geigy and Reich farm sites. Ciba-Geigy was a dye manufacturing plant from 1952 to the 1990s. The hazardous waste the company produced was improperly disposed of. The waste produced was either stored in drums or pumped through the town through a pipeline into the Atlantic Oceans. The Reich farm site exposure was led back to a company called Union Carbide Corporation. The waste was supposedly dumped on Reich farm site through a third-party waste hauler who had leased part of the farmland. Union Carbide labeled drums were found buried on site, and evidence was found of waste being dumped into trenches on site. Over 4,500 waste drums were found. At this point, I think it is important to get a visual as to where these exposures took place relative to one another within the town and the larger area of Dover Township. This is a labeled map of Dover Township in Ocean County, New Jersey. There are several important areas highlighted to note, including how close the Ciba-Geigy and Reich farm sites were to each other, the number of municipal wells relative to the historically contaminated well fields between the two sites and one another located closer to Toms River, as well as the ground level storage tanks that were also contaminated. The map also notes the important locations and path of pipelines used by Ciba-Geigy. I would also like to note that the groundwater flows east towards Toms River, which is not indicated on the map. There were several groups of people affected by these exposures, specifically those that lived in the area. It wasn't until the 1990s residents of Toms River thought there might be a problem. Residents of Toms River noticed a cancer cluster, specifically childhood cancers. To evaluate if there was truly an excess of cancer incidents in the area, the New Jersey Health Department was called upon to investigate. Data was reviewed from the State Cancer Registry from 1979 to 1991. The results indicated there was indeed an excess of childhood brain and central nervous system cancers in Ocean County, as well as Toms River residents. An association is thought to exist between these cancers and prenatal exposure to contaminated drinking water. However, no solid conclusion can be drawn for the cause of the cancer. This figure was taken from the Summary of Childhood Cancer Incidence Health Consultation Report that was done in 1997 by the New Jersey Department of Health. This illustrates the results of the findings that there was a statistically significant difference between observed and expected cancer rates among females and among both sexes combined for ages 0 to 4 years of age. This next table was pulled from the Dover Township Childhood Cancer Investigation Public Health Response Plan, which was published in 1996. This further demonstrates the childhood cancer rates in Ocean County, Dover Township, and Toms River from 1979 to 1991 for children from birth to 19 years of age. Again, the results indicate significant difference in the number of observed cancer rates in brain and central nervous system cancers in Ocean County and in Toms River specifically. There were a large number of contaminants of concern found at multiple exposure sites in Toms River, one of which being lead. While lead is naturally occurring metal in the ground, it is also found in man-made materials such as lead-based paint, which might explain why it was found in Toms River since Ciba-Geigy was a dye and textile plant. Lead was found throughout Toms River in sludge, groundwater, and private wells and soil. Lead can get into the body by ingestion and inhalation. In this case, ingestion by means of water is most likely, considering lead was found in sludge and could have likely affected drinking water. Inhalation is more likely to occur during occupational exposure while metalworking. In cases, lead can also be dermally absorbed, which may be another means of exposure for the people of Toms River. Any amount of lead in the body is harmful. Lead is measured in the blood by micrograms per deciliter. Adults are considered at risk if levels are greater than 10 micrograms per deciliter, and children are considered at risk if levels are more than 5 micrograms per deciliter. Major health effects of lead for adults include cardiovascular effects, nerve disorders, and decreased kidney function. For children, health effects include delayed puberty, decrease in hearing and cognitive performance, and postnatal growth. Another contaminant found at the exposure sites was mercury. Mercury is also a naturally occurring metal and can be found within man-made products too, like a thermometer or fluorescent light bulbs. At the Toms River site, mercury was found in groundwater and sludge. For mercury, routes of exposure could include inhalation, ingestion, and dermal exposure. The route of exposure in this case plays a role in the effect mercury can play. If inhaled, mercury can damage the nervous, digestive, and immune systems. This exposure could also result in fatality. For ingestion or dermal exposure, health effects could include tremors, memory loss, and neuromuscular effects. It is difficult to determine how this situation could have been prevented. Hindsight is always 20/20. Ciba-Geigy is a large corporation, and larger corporations tend to get away with more than they should. Considering the EPA was not established until 1970, the polluting in Toms River was taking place well before that. However, now that the EPA is established, there are extensive protocols for waste disposal strategies. Better guidelines for large corporations, such as Ciba-Geigy, could have been a prevention measure. For example, in 1976, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act was passed. This act provides guidelines for proper hazardous waste management. These guidelines are mandated by Congress. The RCRA is a type of enforcement. There is a department of the EPA that deals with enforcing environmental laws such as this. This could include air enforcement, water enforcement, waste, chemical, and cleanup enforcement, and so on. Having an area of government enforce waste, chemical, and cleanups could have prevented companies like Ciba-Geigy to so carelessly dump waste like they did. One other suggestion for possible prevention is why action was not taken sooner. The Ciba-Geigy Corporation was dumping on land for years, and it wasn't until the pipeline went in that the townspeople started asking questions. For instance, it was not until 1980 that the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection required Ciba-Geigy to start cleaning up the thousands of waste drums on site. Which brings us to the actions of Ciba-Geigy. The company's actions as a whole can be classified as positive and negative, which can be seen on this slide. Ciba-Geigy did some positive things, like they attempted to use carbon filters to clean the groundwater for consumption to prevent contamination. Another positive action is they ceased operation in 1996. The company closing could have been one of the best things for Toms River, because if the company is still manufacturing, there is more waste being produced. At this point, even if the company started getting rid of waste properly, the town is still attempting to clean up the damage done so far. Also, Ciba-Geigy reached a settlement with 69 families that were impacted by cancer in connection to the contaminated water consumption. Now, in this situation, there are some obvious cons or negative choices the company made, one of which being the fact that they discharged wastewater into Toms River and the Atlantic Ocean. Ciba-Geigy also knowingly exposed the town of Toms River to chemicals that put their health at risk and refused to assume responsibility for the cancer cluster in Toms River. Union Carbide was the other company involved in the Toms River exposure, specifically the Reich Farm, where the drums were found buried. Some of the positive actions of Union Carbide included removing the buried barrels of waste at Reich Farms, and they also reached the settlement with the 69 families that were impacted by cancer in connection to the contaminated water consumption. However, the negatives of Union Carbide actions included contributing to the contaminated groundwater in Toms River, leading to the closure of private wells on Reich farms. Similar to Ciba-Geigy, Union Carbide also assumed no responsibility for the cancer cluster in Toms River. The government is expected to protect the people. In the Toms River exposure, the government's actions also had pros and cons. For example, government agencies such as the New Jersey Department of Health and Senior Services and the Agency of Toxic Substances and Disease Registry tested private wells for chemical exposure for links to childhood cancer incidence rates. A positive action taken by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection was that they issued an administrative order to remove 15,000 drums from the Ciba-Geigy site. The same agency also ordered groundwater monitoring at Ciba-Geigy site in 1980. In 1983, the EPA placed Ciba-Geigy on its national priority list. Since then, over 47,000 drums of waste have been removed. However, the government also had some cons to their actions, such as, in 1988, the Agency of Toxic Substances and Disease Registry found human exposure pathways through oral and dermal methods from water in residential wells. However, instead of immediately being shut down, Ciba-Geigy remained in business until 1996. More locally, the local government approved a 10-mile pipeline that allowed waste to be discharged into the Atlantic Ocean. The government was thought to have put financial growth over the health risks of the people, which allowed Ciba-Geigy to continue operations until numerous investigations linked water supply to cancer clusters. For the second part of this presentation, we would like to discuss another case of contamination similar to that of Toms River. The Nyanza Chemical Waste Dump is an active industrial complex located in Ashland, Massachusetts. Several companies have occupied the space from 1917 to 1978, the last of which being Nyanza Incorporated, which occupied the land from 1965 until 1978. This site accumulated large volumes of hazardous wastewater and chemical sludges, which were dumped and buried on site. Over 45,000 tons of chemical sludge were generated. This chemical waste was often disposed of in underground vaults, unlined lagoons, nearby brooks, and wetlands. In this case of exposure, the most susceptible were the residents of Ashland, Massachusetts. The Nyanza Health Study found that young adults who resided in Ashland and played near the site as children had developed types of rare cancers and sarcomas. This initial study led to further investigation. So the next step was to conduct a retrospective study, which was done to see if there was an association between the cancer cluster in Ashland and the Nyanza Chemical Waste Dump. The results indicated that the relative risk of cancer was greater when participants indicated water contact in specific locations relative to Nyanza. Over 100 chemicals were found on the 35-acre site, including volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds, dye manufacturing compounds, and metals. Specifically, beryllium was found on site and in the surrounding areas in the groundwater, sediment, and surface water. Beryllium is found in the environment as a result of human activities such as burning coal, which is released into the air where it can be inhaled. But over time, the beryllium settles into the ground or water supply and can be ingested, which is likely to have occurred in this exposure case. There are several major health factors beryllium is known to cause, such as berylliosis, otherwise known as chronic beryllium or CBD. Although CBD also has a genetic component of susceptibility, CBD is associated with the inhalation of beryllium. Symptoms include difficulty breathing, weakness, and loss of appetite. This can also be fatal. Beryllium is known as a carcinogen and can cause lung cancer. Another chemical found abundantly throughout the site was chromium. Chromium was found in the ground and surface water, sediment, sludge, and soil, and also in fish tissue of nearby waters. Chromium is a naturally occurring element and is commonly used in the dye manufacturing process. Routes of exposure for chromium include ingestion, inhalation, and dermal contact. Chromium has been known to cause major health effects in people exposed, such as respiratory tract problems, and if exposure is prolonged, cancer, such as lung cancer. Similar to the Toms River exposure, it is difficult to determine if there were possible prevention strategies that could have intervened at this site. As we learned earlier, the EPA was established in 1970. However, this site was actively running until 1978. The EPA could have stepped in sooner. This could have been a possible prevention. Also, the residents of the town could have been more self-advocating, and if they noticed something was wrong, they could have reached out to their local offices to intervene. In an article about Ashland, Massachusetts residents, someone recalls there being very colorful puddles around the site, depending on whatever color dye the factory was making that week. If the residents noticed things like this, there is no reason to believe the local government did not also notice these. Perhaps if the local government intervened earlier, the exposure, or at least part of it, could have been prevented. The Nyanza Chemical Waste Dump took actions that could be categorized as both positive and negative. One of the pros is that in 1978, the company ceased operations. This was a positive for Ashland, Massachusetts, because it would give the town and the EPA time to recover and reverse the chemical exposure this town faced. Nyanza Chemical Waste was also required to pay a total of $8 million towards cleanup activities. Some funds went toward the EPA for their efforts, while some were dispersed to other efforts like the Natural Resources Trustees and the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Some of the negative actions of Nyanza Chemical Dump included the main issue, which was improper and irresponsible waste disposal. They also knowingly exposed residents to harmful chemicals, and although eventually ceased operations in 1978, Nyanza could have ceased operations sooner considering how long the plant was open for. This could also have prevented a significant amount of exposure for the residents. When government agencies did eventually intervene, their actions also had positive and negative associations. For example, the EPA contract research found mercury in a nearby river in 1970. These researchers then launched a larger investigation. However, at the same time, this is a con because if mercury was found in 1970, why was the operation allowed to continue until 1978? The EPA added Nyanza Chemical Dump to the national priority list in 1982. But again, this is a full 12 years after the initial findings. The EPA paid the site a lot of attention, launching a source control cleanup between 1990 and 1992. However, the initial 1991 off-site groundwater remedy plan proved to not be effective. It wasn't realized right away. However, a pro to this con is that a new plan was implemented in 2006. To recap and conclude, the Toms River exposure site found cancer clusters linked to Ciba-Geigy and Reich farms, improper waste disposal. The most affected group in this exposure were females under the age of 5. A major source of contamination was the drinking water. And the government was slow to action, but the EPA stepped in to help clean up the site. In Ashland, Massachusetts, the Nyanza Chemical Dump site was responsible for contamination of the town of Ashland. Young children were mostly affected, specifically ones who played near the site. A major source of contamination and exposure was the grounds near the Nyanza chemical site. And again here we saw the government was slow to action, but the EPA did eventually step in. I think an important lesson to learn from both of these case studies is that the people can be their own advocates. And if someone could have raised their voice sooner and earlier, the extent of these exposures may not have been so extreme. On the next 2 slides, please find our references used throughout this presentation. Thank you for listening.